Welcome back to day 2 of our NANODEK build. I have my NANODEK still in the press, and I also got the rest of my supplies ready for today. We're going to need the NANODEK fingerboard template. We are going to need a pencil. We will need scissors, a piece of sandpaper, and the NANODEK fingerboard parts, along with the tool and the screw which we use to make the NANODEK holes. Now these are some small parts, so I recommend you keep them together in a well-contained area where you're not going to lose them. Try not to do this over a carpet, and if you do have to, maybe put these in a little container so you don't lose the parts. First thing I'm going to do is take my mold, and before I do anything else, I'm going to mark the midpoint on the mold. The way I can do this is with a ruler, or you can even just estimate based on the template that we have. So I'm going to show you how to just estimate without a ruler. We're going to start with the ends of the mold and mark the center of those first. The way you can do this, just line up the template so it looks like there's about an equal amount of mold showing on either side. So something like that. And mark both the bottom and the top mold. Just in the center. Of course, doing this with a ruler is much more precise, but this is actually precise enough for our NANODEKs. This mold actually already had a line drawn on it because I had used this mold before. Next, I'm going to remove the rubber bands from the mold, but I'm not going to take the mold apart yet because I'm going to want to mark the center on the sides of the mold as well. And these center lines are going to be used as reference points for positioning the template when we draw the template onto the NANODEK. Be careful when taking your rubber bands off the mold. You don't want to break them because you'll reuse these to make more NANODEKs. Although you can always get more rubber bands or use any types of rubber bands for pressing your boards. So actually, before I even take this last one off, because there's a chance I may move the board a little bit in the press by doing that, I'm going to mark the center of the sides. So similarly, I'm going to use my template. I'm going to make it so about an equal amount of mold is showing on either side of the template, and mark right in the middle that notch that's on the template. Now that I've got my markings, I'm going to take the last rubber band off. And now I'm going to carefully take the mold apart. I want to make sure I don't move the board off the mold when I do this. And I'm actually going to flip the mold upside down. So what I was calling the bottom mold is now going to be on the top. And we're going to take that piece off of our mold, leaving the board on the other mold. If we shift the board at all, we lose our alignment with where it was in the press, which means that if we mark those center lines that we just created, the board won't actually be centered, meaning the concave of the board might not run down the middle of the board when we shape the deck. So that's why it's important to leave the board on the mold unadjusted while we mark our reference lines. Now I'm going to look at where those reference points were, and I'm going to make a little mark on my template, on my board, where those marks are. Once I've got those marked, I can take the board off the mold. But I'm actually not going to do that yet. So once I have those marks, I'm going to, still leaving the board on the mold, I'm going to use one of the extra pieces of veneer in my kit. You can also use any sheet of paper to do this, and draw a line connecting those points. So I'm going to have two lines going across the center of my board, both the horizontal center line and the vertical center line. And try to make these lines light because you're going to erase them later. And what you may notice is that it doesn't look like the line is centered on the paper. And that's actually okay, because what might have happened is when you put your paper in the mold and press the board, it may have shifted during the pressing. So the main thing we care about is actually where the lines are in relation to the concave, which is that curve down the center of the board, and the kicks, which is where the board flips up at the end. So if I look closely at this, it's always good to do a simple look check, a simple visual check, to make sure things look like they're aligned. So it looks like my line runs down the center of my concave, which is great, even though it looks like the line is off to the side. You can even see how the mold sticks out a little bit more on this side than on this side, which means that the paper's shifted a little bit. And the other lines look good as well. It looks like I may have to redo this one though. So I'm just going to readjust this, my horizontal one. And that's the nice thing about pencil is you can adjust as much as you want. I just mismarked my line there. There we go. It looks centered. Next, I'm going to take my template, and you can see that there's some little notches here. We're going to use these to align the template on the uncut deck. So I have my template on top of the deck, and I like to leave the board on the mold still while doing this, just because it gives it a nice support, rather than if we took it off you might push in on the board. So this is nice and firm. And you're going to line it up so that your lines pass through the center of these notches. And you may find that you may need to adjust your lines a little bit. Like I could see that I didn't catch this earlier. That line was a little off, so I'm going to readjust this one. And it's okay if things aren't perfect the first time around. That looks good. I'm going to use a pencil and mark the center of each of these holes. It's really important to mark the exact center of these holes so that you get aligned truck holes. If you don't mark the exact center, you may not be able to get your trucks on right, because they need to be very precise in order to fit the trucks. So I just mark a little dot in the center of each of these holes. And then trace the outline. And of course, the notches will show up when you trace, but we're going to smooth those out just by hand because they're so small. We can just connect them very easily by hand without the template after we draw the template. And you want this line to be dark enough where you can see it easily, but not so dark. Ultimately, this is going to go away. You won't see this line because you can erase it, or you'll be cutting along it, so you can even just sand it away. There it is. I'm going to take this off my mold. So now we have our board off the mold. If it still feels a little bit wet, you can set it outside in the sun to dry a little bit. It's still a little sensitive, and it will be maybe for a day more, so try not to put anything heavy on this and let it just kind of sit without any stresses on it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make my holes next. And I'm going to use the mold as a support again for this, because I'm going to be pushing down as I make these holes, and this is going to provide a better support. If I do it off the mold, it's going to push the board down. You can see it's got some flexibility to it. So I'm going to do it on the mold. If we push down too much off the mold, we may end up with a board that has a little bit of a bow in it. To make the holes, first I'm going to take this little tiny screw and mark a little indent on each of those points. And I'm going to use the skate tool, which is this little tool, to screw the holes such that we actually make a hole. So it's kind of like drilling, but manually. And this may take a little bit of time, so just be patient. And you're just going to apply a little bit of force as you twist, and that will guide the screw through the board. And we're going to just keep checking and making sure we come through. We want to stop as soon as we come through to the other side of the board. You may also have noticed that I'm doing this on what's ultimately going to be the bottom side of the board. And that is really important actually, because if we start from this side, we have a way better chance that everything's going to align properly. All right, so one screw is through. I'm going to do that 7 more times for the remaining holes. I'm just about to finish up the last hole here, and the best technique for making these holes is to start with the tool, get the screw in just enough so that it can stand up sort of on its own, just like that. And then you could twist it the rest of the way by hand. And what this helps to do is prevents you from going too deep and then puncturing your mold on the other side. It's okay if you have some little marks on your mold from doing this, but as you can see, just came through. When we do this where we hold the board and twist it with our hand, we make sure we don't, that when the screw comes through, it doesn't go into the mold. Again, if you do get marks on your mold, little indentations, it is fine. The mold will still be able to be used, but it may, if you do that repeatedly, if you're making a lot of these, it may wear the mold out sooner than if you don't make those puncture marks, because then that creates, when you create a lot of those marks, it may affect the strength and how the board gets pressed. So I've got all my holes. I'm going to clear them out a little bit more with my escape tool by just sticking the tool in and just twisting a little bit so it clears it out. Next, I am going to use scissors to cut the board out. I'm going to try to do this in a way that puts as least stress on the board as possible and makes it, and try not to bend it too much, because if we bend it too much, we risk bending the board out of shape. Thankfully, if it bent out of shape, it's still bendable back into shape, so you can always put it back on your mold and make some final little adjustments to bend it back into shape if that happens. If it's really bending too much, it means the board probably hasn't dried enough. So bend it back into position, pause the process, and set it outside in the sun to dry. And it may need another whole day to actually dry and get really a little bit harder so that it doesn't bend as much. It doesn't need to go back in the mold though. You can just let it dry outside of the mold. So I'm going to cut along the flat edges first. And I want to get as close to my line as possible without cutting into the line. So you can always go back and take more material off. You can't really put it back on very easily though. So I'd rather go back a second time if I need to take more off than take too much off the first time. I'm just putting it back on the mold because I do feel it flexing a little bit, so I'm just getting it back into shape every time I do this. It's okay if you have any slightly jagged corners at this stage, because sanding is going to help smooth that out later on. Okay, there's our shape. It's looking great so far. The last couple steps here are going to be to sand it, to smooth it all out, and then we're going to put it together. So for sanding it, I'm just going to take some sandpaper and go along the edges. And use your line as a reference that you drew to let you know how far to really go with your sanding. Once I've sanded all of the edges, I can erase the center lines. If there's any stray lines on the edges from marking your template originally, you can erase those as well. Next, you can put your artwork on your board. Do your artwork however you like. Or you can assemble your board first and then do the artwork afterwards. It's really up to you. You may find it easier to work on when the board is unassembled and it's just the NANODEK by itself, like this. If the paper does still feel a little wet, pause for today, make this the end of your progress for today. Set the board somewhere dry and warm, that way it can that way the glue can dry a little bit more, and when you come back, the paper will be a little bit better for taking on the colored pencil or whatever paint or marker or whatever it is you're experimenting with for your artwork. I'm just going to go ahead and finish this now though, so you can see how to assemble your board. In each kit there are 8 of these little black screws. They're very tiny, and you're going to poke these through the top side of your board. And attach them to the trucks. The trucks are these pieces that come in your kit. And to assemble them correctly, you place the kingpin, which is, you actually can't really see the kingpin here, but you can see the bushing which goes around the kingpin. There's a little rubber piece called a bushing. That is going to go on the inside of the skateboard, so the trucks are going to go like that. If you do it this way, something very strange happens is when you lean to the right, your board turns left. But we want, when we lean to the right, our board to go right, so we do it this way. And they don't screw in very much. So don't worry if it doesn't feel like they're going in deep, because they actually don't go in very deep. They'll just catch on. If you find that you're twisting though and the trucks aren't sticking, you may need to just reposition the trucks to align better to the holes. I've got my 2 trucks on. Now I will put the wheels on. These are our wheels, and there are these little nuts that go with the wheels. We're going to use the other end of our tool to install the wheels. Inside each wheel is a little bearing which helps the wheels roll, and that bearing is going to go on the inside of the board. If you notice, it's offset inside the wheel. It's offset to one side of the wheel, so we're going to put it on so that the bearing, the side of the bearing is closer to, goes on the inside of the trucks. And we twist to the right whenever we're tightening. And nothing needs to be extremely tight. If it's so tight that the wheel doesn't spin, just loosen it up a little tiny bit so that the wheel can spin. If it feels like you're forcing something, stop what you're doing and take a step back and look closely at what you're doing, because it may not be the right thing. You may be damaging something if it's being forced, because all of these components go on relatively easily. They may take some time, but they do go on easily. Now just one final adjustment before we're ready to ride this. The trucks. So that bushing I mentioned earlier controls how loose or tight the trucks are. I'm actually going to tighten this up just a little bit more. And it's ready. However, I noticed that this still is a little soft, so I was going to demonstrate on how the trucks might twist, but it's a little too soft to show you that. So I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to do one last check, make sure that my board is fully conformed to the mold. It's retained its shape fully through everything that we were doing while we were working on it. And it looks good to me. Looks like it's got a really nice, fun shape. And I'm just going to set it aside. I'm going to put it out in the sun and let it dry. It'll probably be ready by tomorrow to do a little bit more stuff like playing with it with tricks and things. But in the meantime, I do have a board that's already been made. This one's a lot firmer. It doesn't feel wet, it's stiffer. This one has been fully dried. This has been made for a while. And the trucks on this one, I can show you a little bit better with how they adjust. When you lean to one side or the other side, they kind of wiggle back and forth. That is a loose truck. A tight truck, you can't really do that with as easily. So this one is tight. It's not really adjusting at all. And the way we can change that is using this end of our tool. We can twist the nut to the left to make the trucks looser, or to the right to make them tighter. And that way when we lean, the board will turn more. Just be careful not to make them too loose, because the nut can fall off, and they're very difficult to find when they fall on the ground because they're so small. So keep them loose enough, or tight enough rather, that you can at least see the kingpin, which is the thing that you're actually tightening the nut around, so that you can see that just coming through the nut. If the nut comes up taller than the kingpin, the thing that's sitting on, there's a good chance it can fall off later on. The tighter it is, the less of a chance there will be that this falls off. And you'll keep your skate tool near your board at all times, because you're probably going to constantly need to make adjustments. Set everything aside, put it back in the box, and you can start making more boards. Or we can take out our box that's got our grind rail that's ready to ride and start doing some tricks. I'm not really good at the trick part of this, but I'll leave that up to everyone watching. Share your tricks and tag at NANODEK FB, NANODEK on Instagram. Use the hashtag NANODEK, NANODEK. And let's see your tricks. Well, that one was almost impressive.